Sorry, this is going to be in the way because I can't figure out a comfortable enough angle where I'm in front of the camera and this is out of the shot, but close enough to me for my mic. Full disclosure, I have watched this episode. And I might not be doing this for every episode. I did this for She-Hulk because I knew at the time we were not going to be doing weekly episodes of the podcast for She-Hulk. By the podcast, I mean our Marvel podcast, Hit Pause MCU. I wanted to do weekly discussions about it, but I knew it wasn't going to be possible during the time for that show. But what I originally wanted to do with these Marvel shows is to have weekly discussions and podcasts per episode for the ones that come out that are weekly. I know Echo is going to be coming out, and that's supposed to drop all at once unless they're changing the plans for that. I'm not too sure. But with shows like Loki, WandaVision, I like to theorize and then come up with like topics of discussion, what we think is going to happen, what like a lot of the Easter eggs and stuff mean. And I like coming into that fresh without watching the next episode to taint that view or experience in that episode. Obviously, She-Hulk wasn't really that. There was kind of that mystery like, oh, who's after her blood? What's this group or this person or whoever that's following her and trying to keep tabs on her? But ultimately, it was just like a weekly comedy series that was set in the overall MCU and kind of makes fun of the MCU at the same time. Whereas with Loki, there's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of what's going on, who's working behind the scenes. And obviously, we got a lot of that answered in the first season and some of the movies and stuff following that. But even still, this is a big show with a lot of big topics and a lot of stuff going on where you gotta kind of like theorize and see and try to think like what's happening. But also the big thing for me is this is a time travel show, and I love time travel fiction. I have a love-hate relationship with it, where a lot of my favorite stuff involving time travel, but I never, ever, ever see anything that's consistent with time travel. Meaning that there's rules set in place, and then they just ignore those rules for the plot or the story that they're trying to tell. And it ultimately just destroys the whole concept of the whole purpose of that narrative. Stuff like, I don't know, like Terminator and things like that, where you see like, oh, going to the past changes the future, but then also going to the past, you fulfill your destiny of becoming the father of John Connor, which wouldn't have happened if you didn't go back in time to be. I don't know. It's questions like that like around the time of Endgame where they were introducing time travel to the MCU. I felt like that thought process was kind of thought out pretty well and explained pretty well, where they have their set rules and they followed it pretty closely, and I think it was pretty easy to follow. They weren't worried about like branch timelines or anything like that. It's just, yeah, going to the past changes things, and it creates a timeline. The Ancient One briefly mentioned that it creates a timeline, but ultimately it doesn't change your past, present, future. However you want to, I don't know, quantify the present that you came from. A lot of fictional time travel media, you go back in time, change something, butterfly effect. It changes the future. Where your timeline doesn't exist anymore, it's a new timeline because you changed things. The MCU didn't really establish that in Endgame. They established there's you going back in time didn't change anything about your past. It just creates a new past, and you don't, when you get brought to the present or present day or from where you came from, you're not brought into a new future. You're brought back to your past present, I guess. Even that description is very confusing, I know. There were some instances of them not being very consistent with that, but could kind of be explained. Although myself and Jordan in one of our previous podcasts got into a pretty big debate over the end of Endgame, where this is a spoiler. You wouldn't be here if you haven't watched it. Captain America being old at the end of Endgame. Was that him returning to the main MCU timeline and waiting things out until he reached up to Sam and Bucky on the bench? Or did he live out in an alternate timeline where things in that timeline have changed and then somehow came back to the MCU timeline to present Sam with a completely new, different shield? Because remember, that one was destroyed. To me, it makes sense him living out in a alternate timeline, which I think is what the directors agree with. And Jordan was on the side of him living out his life in the current MCU and then waiting out that time for Sam and Bucky to arrive at that bench, which is what the writers agree with for Endgame, I should say. Things have come up involving time travel since then. We have Miss Marvel, which introduced a completely different idea of time travel. And obviously, I'm skipping Loki season 1 here because I'm going to clump Loki all together. That was my big gripe about Miss Marvel, as it kind of breaks that idea of time travel that the MCU established in Endgame. But I kind of, I think I may have made a discussion about it on some podcasts, or I was featured on McClunky Squadron podcast and YouTube channel discussing. Actually, you know what? I don't think I did discuss Miss Marvel. I might have brought it up briefly. Actually, you know what? I think I recorded a video that I'm not too sure that I released on Spawn Trap. So I might not have even said this, but I loved Miss Marvel. I think it's one of my favorite MCU shows. But that one episode really bugged me, and it was really cool and kind of like provides closure and everything for the character. But it broke the time travel. And from what I know from an interview with Aman Vellani with New Rockstars, they did bring up that discussion. Aman Vellani brought up that question to the crew when they were working on Miss Marvel, and she was told to not worry about it, and they'll have some sort of fix for that later, I guess, in The Marvels, the movie that's coming out soon. So maybe we might have some answers to that in The Marvels. I don't know how, because that movie is, I think, confirmed the shortest MCU movie that will be released. So I don't know how they'll have time for that. Then we've had Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, but that was kind of centered around going into the quantum realm, but there is like time travel involved with Kang and how that affects the MCU as a whole. We've had multiverse travel with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which you might be able to clump in time travel with that too, because they're in different points of time in the multiverse. But ultimately, for Loki, I think the concept when it was presented, like before the show came out, I remember watching interviews and stuff. Like, what if we've seen the position of what the Avengers thought about time travel, or what they conceived time travel to be, not necessarily that it's the definitive explanation of time travel in the MCU. So we saw Loki kind of present something where there are these branch timelines. The Avengers were creating branches, but those branches were getting pruned by an organization called the TVA. And after watching Loki, I think it was clear to me that what we were seeing in Phase 4, especially with multiverse stuff with Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, What If, these are all things that happen. Even the end of Endgame, I consider events that happen after, actually, Loki Season 2. What we're seeing in Phase 4, Phase 5 of Marvel, I don't consider part of the sacred timeline. I think this is what we're seeing is a result of how Loki ends. This is how the multiverse starts and the sacred timeline breaks and is destroyed. So I think there was a MCU timeline prior to Loki, prior to the events of Loki picking up the Tesseract specifically. That was completely different. So maybe Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, I can see as being, yeah, because I guess there wouldn't be multiple variations of Kang. So yeah, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, Doctor Strange Multiverse Madness, Spider-Man No Way Home, all that stuff would have played out completely differently. They would, because they wouldn't have involved the multiverse in any sort of capacity. Maybe even if you want to take it a step further, anytime that a character has mentioned that they were dreaming didn't actually happen in the sacred timeline. But I think there was, what they established with the timekeepers theory, although we're kind of seeing that doesn't exist. There was some multiversal war. I guess He Who Remains explained this. There was a multiversal war. There was a bunch of different universes at war with each other, colliding with each other, causing a bunch of calamity. And then He Who Remains stepped in and then stopped it all. He found Alioth, weaponized Alioth to form the TVA and create one sacred timeline where there's no other possibilities. There's no free will. Just everything, it always happens as it should be. And then we know that the Avengers, what they did in Endgame, was supposed to happen as well. So everything that we've seen up to Endgame was pretty much what was supposed to happen. That was part of the sacred timeline, and also part of after the sacred timeline is destroyed. And then we get into Loki picking up the Tesseract. Something happened in that course of events where Loki wasn't supposed to pick up the Tesseract. Maybe that moment played out an endless amount of times and Loki never picked up the Tesseract. But at that one moment, he picked up the Tesseract. Steve Rogers, in my mind again, lived out a fantasy in an alternate timeline that wasn't pruned, that the TVA didn't bother pruning because all this other stuff's happening that we're seeing right now in Loki, season 2 specifically. And then past that point, we're getting Phase 4, Phase 5 Marvel that exists post Sacred Timeline. So we're seeing an alternate version of the MCU that exists after the Sacred Timeline was destroyed. There was a time in the timeline where the MCU existed on the Sacred Timeline. We're not seeing that in the MCU right now for Phase 4 and 5 specifically. The Phase 4 and 5 we're seeing right now is post Sacred Timeline. If that makes any sense. I'm also probably completely wrong, or I can be completely wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. I think that makes total sense to me. And like watching the show and everything, I think that kind of makes sense. Stuff that didn't make sense season 1, I thought the TVA existing outside of time didn't make sense. I thought they clearly exist within time. They were being lied to. And I kind of discussed this a bit in our most recent Hit Pause MCU podcast with my friend Cord FTW. We were discussing all of season 1 of Loki, recapping it because we never got to make any content around that. We started Spawn Trap after Loki season 1. So I'm excited to jump into this for this show specifically because this is one of the shows where I would have liked to have been able to discuss it week to week. So I've already seen this episode. I have, just like She-Hulk, I have commitments and obligations to watch this with my brother and his wife. We've been watching MCU stuff. We're doing like a binge watch at some point. It was leading up to like new movies coming and everything, and we're still on that train. We're still watching new stuff. So we're watching Loki. We want to see the new episodes as they come out every week. But I want to be able to make content for it every week. So for this show, we were intending to make podcasts around each and every episode every week. But Jordan, specifically, his schedule seems to be very busy, doesn't line up with me and when I'm going to be able to watch the new episode. Maybe, as of recording this. We might still do a podcast. So this is just like a just-in-case situation. This might not even make it to YouTube. But I'm putting this effort into it, so I might put it on YouTube. So this is just in case we're not able to make a podcast before a new episode. I want to be able to get my thoughts and reactions and everything prior to us watching the new episode, because I want to see if what I'm theorizing or anything lines up with what we're seeing on the show. And let's say if Jordan is a little bit slower on watching the episodes as they come out week to week, and he still wants to have a discussion on the podcast before he watches the next episode, I can keep my opinions to myself, let him go off on what he wants to say about the episode. We can have the discussion about the episode specifically without me spoiling anything, and getting his thoughts on that. I think that works out, right? So if you didn't watch my She-Hulk videos, this is what's going to happen. I've already watched the episode. I'm going to rewatch it with a new lens. Try to pay attention to stuff and see stuff that I might have missed or might want to comment on, and go from there and just have a discussion about it. For this one here, there's a lot of stuff I have questions or comments about. So I'm probably going to be pausing the video a lot. So I'm going to really keep track of my camera recording and everything else. I have a vertical camera recording. I don't even know if it works because this is the first time I'm doing it. So if you see me in the vertical format, hello, it worked. It's just in case. So I'm recording everything at the same time, so hopefully I can sync up everything and I don't lose the recording and I have to do all this over again. There was a moment in She-Hulk where I had to use my camera audio, which sucks, so I don't want to have to go through that again. Specifically, though, I want to get into like if there's any contradictions, if there's any questions or overall bigger pictures on the idea of time travel or the MCU in general and how things like affect that. I want to be a little bit more analytical with this. So I might lose you. This isn't a reaction video. I'm not doing a reaction to the episode. If I know that's very popular on YouTube. If you came here for that, this is not that. But that said, I do miss stuff the first time around. Sometimes I do have a genuine reaction the second time I pick it up. So let me hit play because I really want to get into this discussion here. So let's go. Oh, by the way, before I hit play, actually, just before I delve deep into being analytical about the episode, just in general for the episode, despite everything that I'm going to be talking about, I loved it. I thought it was a fantastic episode. I thought it was a great way to jump back in. I know that there's new directors or writers or something on the show, so things are a little bit different. But specifically, the cinematography and the writing, a lot of the humor, a lot of the character interactions, I loved. I love a lot of the single camera shots, the really spooky horror aspects of the camera that camera angles and everything that they were using. Everything was great. So yeah, so fantastic episode. I'm excited to jump back in and talk about it. So let's hit play. I will pause it here because this is actually an important point that I want to make. Something that I was really, really worried about in season one at the ending was them establishing, TVA exists outside of time. You create branch timelines and stuff like that. But then also like He Who Remains basically destroying everything and creating one single timeline. The fact that Sylvie pushes Loki through the portal at the end of the last season, he winds up in a different TVA that's completely different. I'm like, oh, the TVA, because we ended on a point where we're invested in these TVA characters: Mobius, B-15, Ravonna, and I want to know like what's happening with them. And they got to the point where they just let the timeline branch off, and they ended that seeing what's going to happen, right? And then we see just a new TVA exist. So I was really worried, being a fan of time travel fiction, it was going to do the typical thing and say that, oh, all that stuff is erased. It doesn't exist anymore. This is the new TVA. Time has changed. Even though that's not supposed to be possible with the TVA because they're supposed to exist outside of time. But I'm like, obviously, they exist within the timeline, and that moment changed. And I did mention that on our a recent podcast, I believe. Thinking that obviously, I think that they're on the sacred timeline. After this episode, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's clearly several points in the episode where they make it very clear, no, they don't exist within the timeline, and it seems like the thing that I was worried about them, that whole experience not existing anymore, is not the case. That was not changed. They focus heavily on these characters and where the story continues, and they jumped right back into it. So I'm very happy that they did that. But there's a lot more to say about that specific topic as we continue here. I love this. The fifth element thing right here. Just Loki becoming Lilu. We got Casey here. This part, I want to make a comment here, and I might be completely wrong, but I was under the impression and belief that at the end of Loki season 1, when he goes to the new TVA and is running around looking at like, oh shoot, what's going on, that Casey in this new TVA was one of the TVA agents, like one of the B TVA agents. He was like leading a squad, like saying like follow me or whatever. Am I just like completely misremembering that not happen, or did they just change the direction with this new season with the new writers or directors or whatever? So So Casey's clearly not in that role in this time here. So I was laughing for when I was first watching this. Yeah, I like all the prolonged shots too, like just everything looking eerie and creepy and menacing and suspenseful. So it's yeah, that effect looks so cool. Something I thought about in retrospect after watching this episode, they're mentioning him as an intruder in that past time, not a variant. And I don't know if they brought up variant at all when he goes into the past. Yeah.
Loki?
All right. Something I want to bring up here is what I was mentioning earlier in the video. So, the Avengers going back in time doesn't affect the future. Even Miss Marvel, her going back in time was always meant to happen. So it's a different time of time travel aspect that completely contradicts the Avengers time travel in Endgame. But my whole excuse was with it in my mind was that I forget the character's name. She said some sort of phrase, and I thought that was her like pulling it, like searching for and pulling in an ancestor from a possible future to come to the past to close out everything. So there's more of like an incantation than the bangle itself that Kamala was wearing, pulling her back into time. So that's my mind trying to make sense of the situation so that it doesn't contradict what's happening in the MCU. In that same mindset, Loki has another concept here where you go back in time and it does change your future or your present. And that happens throughout all of this episode. So just the thing crashing down on the tiles, creating the crack, affected the future and it changed the crack. Again, in my mind here, and from this episode, we're figuring out the TVA truly does exist outside of the timeline. And as Mobius said, time works differently in the TVA. So this isn't a time travel rule for the Sacred Timeline or the MCU that exists within the Sacred Timeline. This is a different time travel rule for the TVA. The TVA just exists. It always exists, and you can't change. Well, how do I rephrase that? The TVA can't branch onto a separate, like there's no branching timeline for the TVA. At least this is my theory. There's nothing that like confirms this from this episode. It's just how I'm making sense of the situation. So just the fact that time works differently in the TVA, Loki's going back in time, creates these events that happen that affect the present day TVA that we know, which doesn't happen in the MCU. In the MCU, you go back in time, change something, it creates a branch timeline. But we don't see branches of the TVA, right? It exists outside of that timeline. So I think that the TVA can't branch. If you're changing something, it changes all the TVA. So it has its own time travel rules. If that makes sense. I don't know. Let me know if I'm wrong or if my theory is like too crazy, but I think that makes sense in my mind.
Maybe
It looks so horrifying, but it looks so good, you know?
Don't worry.
Like we talk about like the VFX in Marvel recently and just huge props to the VFX there cuz it looks appropriately horrifying. This is great. This is where we get a little bit of backstory on Kang and Ravonna. A little teaser, not much. Not a lot to go on. But also like the backstory of the TVA here, how they were created. But not really how they were created, how the current TVA is. Like He Who Remains is TVA. Yeah, so we're seeing that there was a pass in the TVA with Kang the Conqueror, and then He Who Remains steps in and then resets everyone's memory and has the current TVA. I'll get back to that thought. Sorry, I'm listening intently here because I want to see. I think it did say. Let me rewind a bit. Actually, no. Loki's rewinding. Let Loki rewind.
I will be proud to lead with you.
And under whose authority did you make the...
Let's pause it there because there's a few things. So continuing off what I said, it seems like to me, what He Who Remains was saying was pretty accurate. There was this big war, Kang the Conqueror, or some one variation of Kang the Conqueror was leading the TVA, or maybe multiple of them. I don't know. There were 5 heads on the wall, so maybe there were 5 Kangs in charge of the TVA or more. Who knows? Something happened where He Who Remains became the only variant left standing, and he mind wiped everyone in the TVA and created a new TVA that worshipped and believed in the timekeepers, creating them and dictating the flow of time. Now that's not completely true, but it seems like a lot of those aspects were true. However, it does kind of conflict a little bit with what He Who Remains was saying. He said he created the TVA. Did he just mean he created the current existence of the TVA? The one that was mind wiped? I'm not 100% sure on that. Also, so it seems like in the past, prior to He Who Remains, Ravonna Renslayer was part of that war that Kang the Conqueror or Conquerors were fighting. However, the subtitles do say He Who Remains, but I think that's just for contextualization for the hearing impaired using closed captions. Trying to follow up on where the previous season was, because we only saw that character as He Who Remains. We have seen him as Kang the Conqueror or a variation of him, in Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, but maybe not all audiences are going to watch this show after watching Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, which I think did not perform very well. So there's a good chance that a lot of people watching the show have not watched Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, which to me, I feel like you should watch Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania before watching this. But again, I think timeline-wise, this happens before Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania or all of MCU Phase 4 and 5, right? Also, the voice in that recording was very much closer to Kang in Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania than it was as Jonathan Majors playing He Who Remains at the end of Loki Season 1. So to me, even though the captions say He Who Remains, I'm pretty sure that who was speaking in the recording was not He Who Remains. He Who Remains is a different character who's dead now, or a variation of him might still exist in this branching timeline multiverse. But what we have is what I think happened. A big multiversal war. King the Conquerors had some sort of variation of the TVA. He Who Remains steps in, weaponizes Goliath, creates one single timeline, erases the memory of the TVA, and sets up a new backstory and religion for the newer TVA, the present one that Loki keeps going back to, that is trying to dictate the flow of the sacred timeline. So yeah, let's get back into it here. I'm curious who these characters are and what their relationship is here. B-15's like looking at him too. So, Mobius and B-15 are coming to the conclusion and acceptance that, hey, we need to stop pruning timelines. We've been lied to. We can't take away people's free will. We can't be like killing trillions of people in another existence that's different from ours. And they thought, Sylvie and Loki were in the same mission. However, after dealing with that, the meeting and everything, Loki comes back and says, "Oh shit, no, the timekeepers religion that you were following, yeah, um, the religion's all fake, but the goal was very true. We need to be pruning timelines because something worse is gonna happen if we don't." So it's an interesting. I'm interested to see where each character is going to end up knowing the different outcomes, because there's an interesting conversation about the morality and what's the right thing to do when you have when you're killing people to stop a war that will destroy everything.
And she kicked me through a time door.
Well, I'd ask who won, but
It was a draw.
both kicked each other through time doors simultaneously?
No. That.
So this is, I didn't pay attention to this before.
That is what we...
This is a painting of the comic book version of Kang the Conqueror. All his variants fighting each other. So it's interesting that they actually painted, or they actually have a painting of Kang the Conqueror when he's trying to change that history into the painting that's next to it being that of the timekeepers. Like weaving the branches and everything there.
We know.
So it's interesting.
And it's on its way.
Oh, how would I not remember that?
Because he wiped your memories. And he obviously did it more than once.
That line kind of confuses me here. He obviously did it more than once. We don't have anything that indicates that's true. We know that he did it once, at least once. We don't really know anything that says that he did it more than once, unless I missed something completely. The only thing that I can think of is if that's in relation to season 1, Mobius putting down his drink and creating rings, not using a coaster and creating rings around the table. Ravonna saying, use a coaster, and then him saying, "What? Those rings were there already." And she says, "Well, they're all from you." And he doesn't seem to remember it, and he says, "Well, maybe it was from some of your other analysts." And just Ravonna saying that she has other analysts, and maybe all those other analysts are all Mobius, but that might just be a stretch. I don't know. So maybe that is obviously more than once. I don't know, but for us right now, all we know, he did it at least once.
How does it look?
Oh, it's all a single shot too. That's so great. I love this. Limit your lunch breaks to 17 minutes. Oh, that's awful.
I have no memory of having my memory wiped.
You sure you know where you're going?
Yeah.
There's a banana there. Is there a banana in a tube? I'm gonna have a lot of questions from here. I'm also paying attention to certain lines here.
I'm Ouroboros. Nice to meet you, Loki.
Ouroboros.
Ouroboros.
But he calls me Obi.
Yeah. I call him Obi.
Okay,
That's
okay.
like a nickname I have. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. First of all, Ouroboros is that snake that eats itself. It bites on its tail and it's a vicious circle, which is very appropriate to the situation that we're seeing right now with the TVA. So it's a very, very appropriate name for this character and the whole plot of this episode right here. So I love that. I love that synergy right there. Just like no matter what you do, it's just a constant circle, right? But what I was focusing on, because I couldn't remember exactly how this dialogue went, but I like that it kind of clears things up here. We're gonna see a point in this episode where, and I'm gonna focus a little bit more on it, but that line specifically, where he's introducing himself as Ouroboros, and Mobius says his name, and then Ouroboros says, "But he calls me Obi." Mobius specifically, that he calls him Obi. And I'll explain why I'm focusing on why it was said in that situation, in that exact lining, and something coming up here.
Could it be 3 or 4?
400 years.
What? Feels like 1,000, right?
Yeah.
Okay. 400 years in TVA time. Let's remember that TVA exists outside of the sacred timeline. The sacred timeline's all happening at once. Past and future, from beginning to end of time, all happening at once, right? The TVA has its own time. They're also saying, like, you have your lunch for 17 minutes. You were last here 400 years ago. So Mobius saying there is no past TVA. Like, he's kind of like, you know that there's a past in TVA. You have your own timeline. The time runs. You've had a past conversation. What you did a few minutes ago was in the past. You have your own timeline, right? So this just, I think that just further cements that this was, they met 400 years ago, or they last seen each other 400 years ago in TVA time, not in sacred timeline time. You know, just clearing that up, if that makes sense.
No sleep.
No sleep. Damn, Obi. Holy shit,
Obi, I just
man.
have a quick question for you.
Here's Obi without glasses. Ooh, I like that Sprite vending
Lewis.
machine, the retro vending machine right there.
May I call you OB?
I want one.
OB? I like that.
Right there. That's what I was concerned about. And why I brought up that previous statement there. That, out of everything, bugged the hell out of me after watching this episode. Because I can't remember the exact phrasing or terminology of this. This is like a closed loop paradox, or I think there's other phrases for it. But essentially, Ouroboros, so Ouroboros tells Loki that he is called OB, like it's his nickname. Loki travels back in time and meets OB in the past and says, "Hey, is it all right if I call you OB?" And OB says, "OB, I like that," insinuating that he got the nickname because Loki went back in time and gave him the nickname after hearing about it from the future, where Obi told him about his nickname. So if that were never to happen, Obi wouldn't have told him the nickname, and Loki wouldn't have went back in time and called him by his nickname. So there's no origin at that point of where the nickname OB came from. It's just, it just came from nowhere. However, that being said, again, we've established time works differently in the TVA, so that's kind of something I can overlook and excuse in this particular medium and show, where it's involving, something that exists outside of time, and there's a whole, like, physical timeline that they're observing, they're like the arbiters of. And then also the fact of the phrasing that we saw earlier. OB saying, "Yeah, Mobius likes to call me OB." He mentioned that Mobius got off the wrong floor, presumably after chasing Loki, although this could have been a different situation altogether. And then Obi tells him, "You're on the wrong floor," and then he leaves immediately. But he knows Mobius enough for Mobius to call him OB. So I'm presuming that they've met prior to that as well, and they had some sort of relationship, and he calls him OB. Or maybe he called him OB after Loki met him, and then he got off the wrong floor in a different situation, and that was the last time he saw him. Just either way, it seems like Mobius has a relationship with OB to be able to call him OB. So that it doesn't necessarily mean that he got that nickname from Loki traveling to the past, but it is insinuating it, and that's very troublesome. Like, that's it causes a lot of problems and a lot of concerns about where, like, how this storytelling, the writing is going to be in the show, and how it's going to contradict with time travel. But I'm gonna overlook that because it was just a funny situation, and it kind of just fit the plot. But I kind of wish that was, like, reworded or rephrased, or just omitted altogether. Like he just goes by OB. Like that could have just been all that was needed, right? But let's continue. So he's seen time slipping before he's seeing Loki here.
How did I not remember that?
Wait, is he talking to you in the past and you're just now remembering it?
Wow, that makes perfect sense.
See, it's just really cool. Like, despite everything I said, that is just really cool. So, I'm sure we're gonna get more moments like that throughout the show. That again, like taking into consideration that the TVA exists outside of time and it has its own timeline and its own timeline rules. Just Loki and knowing that the rules of the TVA clearly state that it can't branch. No matter what you do, it can't branch, so things have to change. So him traveling to the past and then creating these memories as if they've always existed. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but they're actively changing the future or the present to reflect what he's doing in the past is a really cool concept. I hate when there's commitment to that in time travel fiction because that creates a whole bunch of problems. I do prefer the branching timeline and the string theory kind of aspect of time travel, but I do like the idea of this organization has its own separate rule of time that does not affect the main timeline. So there's because they exist within a different capacity, right? I just think that's really cool. It's like you have your time travel rules and the string theory and everything on the main content or the main timeline, the sacred timeline, the MCU, and then you have this little pocket section here that oversees everything, but they can't have that same rule because that's like two separate multiverses at that point. So this has to have a rule saying that nothing can change because they have to be the purveyors of everything in the in everything that's exists in the main timeline, right? So I think that's a just a really cool concept, and I really hope that that's what the case is for the show, because I'm very excited about that if the writing and everything is pulled off really great and we see a lot of cool stuff like this. But it's very complicated and very tricky because you can cause a lot of questions like, wait, that shouldn't happen, that shouldn't exist because it contradicts with this thing here, right? So far there's nothing that like stands out like that other than the OB line, but that was still phrased in a way it's like that can still make sense. And I know I'm being overly analytical, but that's the point of this video. That's what I'm trying to be. But I think it's just really cool that you have like an organization that exists and has its own timeline rules because they have to be the purveyors of the other thing, the main source of time and its own timeline rules. So it's really cool having that mixture and that combination of both in one medium, which I've never really seen before. Unless there is something that exists that does that, then let me know because I'd be really interested in seeing that.
There's no flaw in that logic. I guess time slipping is possible.
See, OB agrees. There's no
So you
flaw in
remember.
that logic.
What did you tell him?
I need to get to the temporal loom so the extractor can pull Loki directly out of the time
Temporal
So I need
loom,
to
I'm
get to the
confused by.
temporal
I'm not.
loom so
I'm
the
not gonna
extractor
make
can
sense
pull
of it
Loki out
until
of
after the show's
the
done.
time stream?
But it
Yeah, this is like a horror scene right here. Also, I saw something on the bottom here. Likelihood of spaghettification increases to 7,000%.
The temporal loom is the heart of the TVA.
Okay.
It's where raw time is refined into physical timeline.
I still don't get that though. You need to explain that more. I don't really get what we're seeing here. Raw time is weaving together new branches. So this is so confusing to me. So just the concept of the temporal loom in general. I feel like I need a further explanation of this because it's so confusing. So they're saying that. So I was trying to make sense of this. Is this? I don't know where like one thing ends, one thing begins. Again, this looks like the Ouroboros snake here. This looks like what I'm looking at. Where does it end? Where does it begin? So those lines that are coming from the left. So he's saying it's pulling in raw time to form the physical timeline. or the physical representation of the timeline. I don't know, but we're getting all these strands woven into a tightly wound thread, right? And there were some like explanations of this thread thing like being made, like how the timekeepers are trying to like weave everything together into one single timeline and everything. But so where does so everything's branching off of this sacred timeline, right? That's where things are branching off from. And this loom is collecting all of those threads and putting them into what? Or is that combined thread the physical representation of the sacred timeline? And if so, is the sacred timeline built off of branched timelines? Which doesn't make sense. So which part is the sacred timeline? Which part is the MCU? Is it the latter half or is it the former half, you know? Is it the branched timelines or is it the the woven timelines? It's so confusing because either way does not make sense. So like it's like if the MCU exists within those branches and they're being combined, what are they being combined into? What is it that we're seeing as the final woven thread? And then the opposite way, if that is the MCU, why is that not branching? Because I thought the MCU was branching, right? Why is that thread not branching? Shouldn't we be seeing that branching? And then what are the other threads that are making up the MCU, right? Where are those coming from if not from the MCU? So it feels like this is going in a circle, you know? The MCU is creating branches that is creating the MCU. So that's the Ouroboros snake. That's what it seems like I'm looking at here. But I don't know. We're just seeing like one single image, and I don't know what is what. All he's saying is that the temporal loom is extracting raw time. Does that mean the timeline or something else? And they're saying it's because it's branching and it's overloading. So that implies that the MCU and the branches are the former half. Then what the fuck is the latter half, you know? So he's just saying that it extracts raw time to create the physical timeline. But what is the physical timeline if not the sacred timeline? Is that not what it is? What is the physical timeline? What are they talking about? So that's where I need more explanation here. That's what I'm so confused by. So, but see, so B-15 doesn't want to prune the branches. Loki does now because it creates other Kangs, you know, or
And Mobius will lose all of his skin. Okay.
so him, his clothes, his the booklet, whatever else he's holding with him got transferred back, but not the time thing that he was holding. Yes, he's holding the other thing that didn't get left behind. So now we're in the future of the TVA. Again, from based on what we're seeing, this has to happen. Unless things are changed, then this gets overwritten and things are a little bit different. But so I think the temporal aura was mentioned in the first season, in the first episode, when Loki walks through that metal detector thing. So that's what this is. This is tracing his temporal aura that he has. So this is like the TVA is collapsing and getting destroyed because of the branch timelines. It looks like here. So the TVA exists on top of the temporal loom. It seems like. Yeah. So I'm curious what this is. So it seems like there's a whole army going after what B-15 thinks are going after Sylvie, but it seems like yeah. So she's leading the charge. It looks like so. Yeah, they're not going after Sylvie. They're trying to see what's happening at the end of time. So she's bringing in a whole army to whatever's at the end of time, which I don't get why. Like, what's going to happen at that point? So something else I thought of, in the last season, it ended with, you know, Mobius and B-15 from the past TVA talking about how there's like 63 branches or whatever, and that he wants them to just let them branch. So it seems like past TVA was during the multiverse war, or at least maybe before the war or while the war was happening. I don't know, but it seems like how they handle branches and stuff is different. Maybe they're more selective with branches that they cut off. Maybe because they're at the command of Kang the Conqueror, who wants to conquer timelines. So he's like, yes, I want you to destroy this timeline because that's part of his goal. That's part of his mission, right? So he's sort of like influencing the TVA to do his bidding there until He Who Remains comes in and says, "No, we're ending that. I'm going to wipe everyone's memory and then create one sacred timeline, and that way all other King variants no longer exist." So that's what kind of makes sense to me in my mind here. Also, I think if I recall, Victoria Alonso's name was in the credits here, and Marvel fired her. So that's crazy seeing her name in the credits. Oh, also something I completely looked over, and there was a shot there. I'll try to bring it up. I can't believe I skipped over that dialogue. So, Loki is at first under the impression that he's time slipping because Sylvie used He Who Remains' tempad, which is completely different. It's this thing right here, to send her back to, I guess, his or like the former TVA of where he first went back to, like prior to wiping everybody and creating the timekeepers. So his tempad kind of like sends him back to the past TVA. So he thought maybe that's why he's time slipping, because Sylvie used that and he got sent to the past when he should have been sent to the right, like the present TVA. I feel like this tempad is it is different and is the reason for like a lot of issues, or like there's a reason why this tempad is different or works differently, and we don't like, we're just getting like a little tease of that, so maybe this will come back in the future. But Sylvie, is presumably using this tempad to travel through the multiverse or through branch timelines. I think this thing still exists, and I think Sylvie has it. I think she's keeping it on her. All right, now we finally see Sylvie, or where we last saw Sylvie. She's traveling to Broxton, Oklahoma in 1982, specifically a branched timeline, not the sacred timeline. I mean, theoretically, she travels to the sacred timeline. She's creating a branched timeline anyway, and that's what this could be. It could be branched just by her being here. But I think time was branching at that point anyway, so she just went to a branched timeline. I don't know how she knew how to get there specifically, with just that that tempad's different, right? It doesn't have the screen and like the user interface on how to like on where to travel. And I don't know if it, well, I guess it would program branch timelines because it detects them, and that's where the TVA gets sent to specifically to prune them. But this is a different tempad. This is He Who Remains' tempad, which is just like it looks like a bracelet, if anything. So I don't know. But yeah, Broxton, Oklahoma. I've seen some people mention that this is significant to Asgard in the comics, because this is where New Asgard in the MCU is in Norway, I think. Whereas in the comics, New Asgard gets placed in Broxton, Oklahoma. So after Ragnarok. So this has significance to the character and everything too. So it's a nice little Easter egg. So I just think it's funny, like Sylvie kills He Who Remains, and then she just has a craving for McDonald's in 1982. Yeah, what a great episode. I loved it, and I'm so looking forward to the rest of the season. Despite me talking about everything, because you might be like, Till, you're like super hypercritical. You're very like, you're over analyzing everything. It does not sound like you like this episode. No, if you recall, I said I have a love-hate relationship with time travel and fiction. And this very much scratches that itch. So a lot of that stuff, like I am critical, like this doesn't make sense, or this, sorry, I hit pause. This doesn't make sense, or this contradicts whatever, and I'm being like super, like I'm overthinking everything, whatever, and I love doing that. So this definitely scratches that itch. I love that this show exists, which is surprising to me because throughout the MCU, I know like Loki is a huge fan favorite. He's a very popular character, just purely on Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of the character. That's the only reason why I feel like people love and latched onto the character since the beginning when he was introduced in Thor, and especially his performance in Avengers, and then throughout all of the MCU he's just been consistently fantastic. That said, I've never really been a huge fan of the character in general. It's like I like Tom Hiddleston, I like Loki in the MCU. Just the character itself, it's not like I'm not like over the moon for like everybody else is. So I wasn't really like hyped or anything off the first season of Loki. Watched the first season, love the first season, and all this stuff that we're seeing so far with season 2. I love it as well. Loki is definitely up there, like one of my top shows for the MCU. This is going to be a fantastic season, and I'm very much looking forward to more. And I hope we can talk more about it on our podcast, Hit Pause MCU. I'm hoping I get to sit and chat with Jordan as we discuss episode 1 before we go into episode 2. So hopefully we can do that, and we can keep doing weekly podcasts from this. I know that there is going to be a point where he's going to be away and not going to be able to watch the show and discuss it. So I'll see if I can work around having somebody else fill his place until that time, or just waiting a week until we can sync back up, and I won't be able to catch the next episode. But if that's the case, like I'll try to do these as much as I know that there's a possibility we might not be able to do the episode or the podcast before we can record or watch the new episode. So I'm going to try to do these as like filler stuff, like just in case. I think, or even like in addition to, I don't know. I like maybe like an add-on piece of content. We'll see. If you are watching this on YouTube, so that means I made my decision, but I don't know if I'm going to be doing these for every episode. And my camera's running out of battery, so but I will be doing these as much as I can. So make sure that you follow the Spawn Trap Hit Pause MCU podcast. Make sure that you subscribe, turn on notifications so you know when we go live or when we have new videos out. And let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next one.